So we had an interesting happy hour last night.
We did.
We had a discussion among some clients about the fact that we all live in a simulation. Have you heard this theory?
I haven't.
The universe is a simulation.
Right now it's a simulation?
Right now we're all simulated. It's just like a simulated reality.
Interesting.
Sort of emergent characteristic of various
various
atoms.
I see. What's the proof that we're living in a simulation?
Well, there is none.
Oh.
It's theory.
You can't prove it?
Ooh. Prove it.
Whoa.
That's going to be the intro. That's going to be the intro right there. What's that show? Quantum Leap. Did you ever watch Quantum Leap? Yeah. It's like, the guy has to go back in time to certain moments and fix things. Maybe that's happening right now.
Could be.
Maybe we're like kind of constantly being corrected.
What if like we were in control, where the timeline that like I could exist in was somehow up to me?
Oh, that'd be weird. So like everything that can possibly go right for you from your perception is happening to you. But everything else goes wrong for everyone else.
Well,
and then from my perspective, it's just branching off into a timeline where I, kind of live forever and, do no wrong.
Good. I mean, but not if everything's going fine for me, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything's going wrong for other people. It could be you could create that too.
We're all experiencing the world, one consciousness, subjectively. What a way to start a podcast about computational design.
Is this what I signed up for?
So the way this works is it usually starts off with a bunch of nonsense, and eventually we work our way into a comfortable place where we actually start talking about like serious things related to architecture and computation.
And we're going live in 3, 2, 1. We can recreate all that. No, just kidding.
Well, we're in the simulation, so we just reboot, right? Like
we have the power of an editing suite on the laptop.
No way.
So we're here with Shelby Doyle.
Hi.
From Des Moines, professor at Iowa State.
Do you want me to do this part? No. Okay. Yes.
Okay. You're like, you're going to screw it up. 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 You're going to screw it up.
It's also
you drove 2.5 hours for this.
Yeah, I did. 2 hours.
You drive as fast as Steve?
I do, yeah.
It's efficient. It's not fuel efficient, but it's time efficient.
Okay.
So I don't know if I'm comfortable being called from Des Moines.
Okay.
All right. You know what?
Well, you are right now. You have a house.
I bought a house.
The fact that you have a house now in Des Moines means you're from there.
Des Moines. Is that what it means?
Yeah, you're
currently residing.
Currently residing in Des Moines.
But you have a house. That's that's unconventional for like a millennial.
I know, but I could afford a house in Des Moines. That's like the best thing about Iowa.
I'm sorry. Did you just claim that Shelby's a millennial?
I'm an old millennial.
All right.
An elder millennial, if you will.
I kind of fall in that camp too.
Yeah.
Oh boy. And so what am I?
It's kind of like
Gen Z. I think Gen Z is after millennial.
Yeah, you don't fall into Gen Z.
No.
Millennials, I think. Yeah. Gen Z are like people that were born in like 2004 or something like that. It's kind of like in the early 2000s.
You're not that young. We're apparently actually Zennials. We're between Gen X and millennials.
We know enough to be embarrassed by the millennials.
Yeah, exactly. We also see,
and we also think Gen X is kind of cool. So
a little bit, yeah. We're like, you had better music and movies,
and we remember we listened to it.
And then we see ourselves in the millennials, but also hate it simultaneously.
But on top of that, we're aware of when we switch timelines.
Right.
Right.
It's true. That's our superpower.
It happened around the time when the internet came, because that's what we remember that because we remember a time before the internet. That's really where the line to me draws. Because that to me is where the generation split actually happens. Is if you can remember a time where there was no internet in your life, then maybe you're not a millennial. Maybe you're somewhere either in between or part of the previous generation. But that's really where the big divide was, right?
It's true, and it makes teaching sometimes really interesting and really complicated because you're like, you've never not had a cell phone to people, you know, like you're talking to someone and like the notion of carrying an iPhone around in your pocket is their reality, you know, that's their everyday. And you're like, I remember a time when we had phone books and atlases, and you feel ancient. You feel like this like person who's like traveled here from the past to be like, here, listen, children, I have these things that we used to have.
Let me tell you the tales of using an atlas when visiting another country.
Or like MapQuest, like looking up instructions and printing them out, and like how that seems like such a strange thing to someone who's never done it.
I remember, I mean, this was a pretty recent trip. I mean, 2005. You know, you'd have Lonely Planet with you when you would go on your European trip, and you know, you didn't have
Yelp and
reviews
and Google Maps.
Well, it's like a phone with internet. I mean, you had to get like a burner phone when you went over there if you wanted to contact anyone, and they weren't smart, so you're like, you know, having to look things up and look up train schedules and stuff like that. And then I remember going back to Europe maybe, you know, 6 or 7 years later when I actually had a professional income and I could have like a smartphone and connect to internet and stuff. I'm like, oh, this is a lot easier.
Right. And like not having traveler's checks and being able to take your ATM card and just like get money.
Traveler's checks.
But I went to China last year for the first time in 10 years, and everything is paid through WeChat. But you have to have a Chinese bank account to be able to have WeChat Pay. I'm sure that's not what it's called, but to pay through your phone. And so I was not there long enough to do that. I was there for like 10 days for Cadria, and I had to get cash out because no one would take Visa either. Like a lot of places wouldn't take an American Visa. And so I really did feel like a time traveler that had like come from the past with my like dirty money to like hand to people. And like I did in restaurants.
Currency.
And they'd kind of look at me like, we don't have any change. And they'd like run around and like try to find change. And like, it was this really interesting moment to say like, you know, we actually are going to move into this world where a lot of the things that we even use now don't exist, because I ran an unfortunate experiment of leaving my wallet on a flight on my way to Mexico City. Yep. Had my passport, but managed to exist there without many problems because I had Venmo and people would pay for things or I'd Venmo them. I had Uber. Everything was still hooked up my credit cards. And it was this very sort of strange experiment of being like, actually, you don't even need a credit card to travel anymore. And I don't think 20 years ago that would have gone quite so well.
Right.
Like, you know, I mean, there are other ways to get money, but I think it was kind of like, it felt like, you know, time traveling again. I guess that's our theme of like
that's the podcast
episode.
theme.
Yeah.
That will be in the title somehow.
Yeah.
Well, now we have to predict what the existence will be like in 5 to 10 years from now, right? If we're talking about time traveling.
That's a big question. How long do we have?
I think it's harder to go, like in terms of time travel theory, harder to go forward than backward. Like, well, but both are impossible, but
I guess Nate doesn't believe in magic.
I also think that it's really interesting to read.
There's no magic in this world, Steve.
Read science fiction that was written in the 1950s, and to see how the present day is perceived and how different things are and how similar. You know, I mean, like when I remember reading Fahrenheit 451. All right, I was going to say it wrong. Fahrenheit 451 and the ear tamps, and everyone reading their ear tamps and
everyone
having like
disconnected from each other and watching
and like having constant media in your ears. And at the time, reading it, and you know, it was probably the early 90s, and being like, "This is wild." And now, like everyone's running around with AirPods, and you're like, "Oh, we're there. We've made this happen." Like you can never be without media if you choose, which is like, it's kind of fascinating. And I don't know if it's good or if it's bad, and I don't know that any of us can in some ways know the outcomes, but I think we've seen enough sci-fi to know that this isn't going to turn out well.
Well, we were talking about this the other night, like being without media as being now almost a privilege of the rich. You have to be very wealthy now
to pay for the resources to take care of the same amount of work and tasks that you would be enamored or, you know, sort of distracted by through phones and laptops or whatever. Like getting your child into a private charter school that is technology less, and sort of having the human interaction that happens in a development where the focus is one-on-one, for example. And there's also a discussion about how folks who are growing up with text messages are seeing that the value of a conversation through text message as being just as equivalent as a conversation in front of someone with nonverbals and with someone's presence. And they equate that to being the same, which is in a way unhealthy, right? Because there's a complete lack of a lot of more information that you would get from someone being in front of them.
It's interesting.
Yeah. So I think there's going to be a lot of interesting implications for that generationally and behaviorally. And
well, I think as a generation who's watched things go from paper to email to text messaging and Slack and Snapchat and Instagram, and the way you communicate being so altered by that. Because even things like writing an email are professional skill sets that I feel like a lot of times students just don't have that experience. Like they'll write email like it's text messaging, and you're like, these aren't the same medium, and they have, or media, and they have different ways in which they're supposed to be used. But I don't know if that means like there'll be a flattening of the way we communicate across platforms, or if it's that there really is going to be like text message etiquette, Slack etiquette, email etiquette.
What I find weird is when people send me messages on LinkedIn formatted as an email.
I do find that weird.
Is it supposed to be like a chat thing?
Right.
But people will do like, hello, Nate, and then do the body, and then do
like a signature,
and a signature. And I'm like, I would expect that people would want to have a more dynamic conversation, but it's kind of the professional social network. So if things get composed as more akin to email, even though it's meant to be more, so it's an interesting.
But it's also like that blurring of professional and personal that I think is really complicated by all of this. Is that there's, I find myself like if I'm text messaging someone who is in a professional context, it feels like you want to almost formalize it, but you're like, can you write a formal text message? Like, is that a thing?
Yeah. When I started texting clients, in practice, it was sort of like, this feels weird.
Yeah.
Like this is kind of like my phone. But you're at work.
Yeah.
Do
you send an emoji?
Weird.
I mean, like.
I don't know.
It's confusing.
Like thumbs up emoji?
Yeah, like good job.
All right, thanks.
Boy, this RFI is really making the project seem like it's falling apart. Poop emoji. I'll see you at the milestone meeting, client.
Oh, the roof's leaking, and then like the water spray emoji. And then like shrug.
Yeah. Whose liability is this?
I do enjoy sending GIFs though, or GIFs. All right, let's settle this.
It's GIF. It's a GIF.
It's a GIF because Jif is a peanut butter.
If they wanted to be GIF, they would put a J in it instead of a G.
Can you imagine sending someone GIF?
Just a peanut, like an actual just jar of peanut butter.
Send some people a jar of peanut butter.
They're like, I sent you a GIF.
I heard this is a trendy thing to do among like people now, is to send people a GIF, and so you're sending them peanut butter. It's absurd.
I love peanut butter.
Yeah, I know you do. Steve introduced me to scotcheroos, which I didn't know. I didn't think they were a real thing because I'm not from Iowa, and I thought it was like, oh, let's make fun of the new kids.
All right, so a scotcheroo is like a Rice Krispies treat with butterscotch. Mm-hmm. And sometimes peanut butter.
Right.
And then it's layered with chocolate icing. And it's called a scotcheroo.
Right.
And to make a scotcheroo even more mind-blowing, you put peanut butter on top of it. And then, if you're really going for it, it's crunchy peanut butter.
See?
Huh.
I thought this was a Midwest thing. It's just an Iowa thing.
It's just a Steve thing.
It's just Steve. He did make it up.
I think he made this up. It's just something Steve started doing one day and tried to make it seem like, oh, everyone's doing this in the Midwest.
I created a timeline where scotcheroos was infiltrated into a regional culture.
I see.
And so,
and then they kicked him out of that timeline back into this one, and I'm so confused why it's not a thing. So speaking of timelines, we're going to rewind a little bit.
You wanted us to get all relaxed. Now we're relaxed.
Now we're a little too relaxed. So how did you get into architecture?
Oh no.
Oh boy.
The question. So we're gonna build our way up.
Okay.
We're gonna build our way up to how you ended up in Des Moines, Iowa.
We have a long time. How did I end up in architecture? So I am originally from Virginia. I went to the University of Virginia, and I did not go to school with the intention of studying architecture. So I ended up in architecture almost by happenstance. But I had gone to study the history and literature of the American South because of Virginia's very complex history, as we unfortunately recently saw in Charlottesville, with race and with the Civil War in particular, and the narratives that came out of that. Because I grew up very close to the West Virginia border, and there would be people who were from West Virginia flying the Confederate flag and saying that it was heritage, but West Virginia seceded from Virginia to fight for the Union. And so there's these really strange narratives of American culture that have developed and continue to play out in the present day. So I'd sort of started taking these history classes, was taking art classes, had taken AutoCAD, release 14 in high school. So I didn't know where all this was adding up to at this point, I'm 18. And I played club volleyball with several women who were in architecture, and they were like, hey, like you should come take this class in my first year. So I took Sanda Iliescu's, it was sort of the second semester architecture class. And I was like, wait, there's a way that you can draw, think about history, and think about the future, and they'll pay you for it. Like, that's a job. And I was like, yeah, sign me up. So I transferred into the architecture school in my second year and then finished in the next 3. So does that answer the question?
Well, that's step one.
That's step one.
So after that?
And after that, I moved to New York City, and I practiced for 4 or 5 years. I can't remember, 5 years in New York, primarily for Cook Fox architects.
Okay. So when you were getting into architecture, you've kind of found like an additional niche for yourself on the computation side, and like getting into like the digital front of this. When did that happen? Like,
very reluctantly, actually. Yeah. I mean, I went to the GSD. It was 2008. I mean, I had been using AutoCAD at that point for 12 years, probably, and everything I had learned in undergraduate was orthographic drawing, orthographic projection. It was not a moment where the computer was being used in architectural education. I graduated in 2004, and I think right at the very end, we got a laser cutter, and it like got kept in like a locked closet because it was like,
this is expensive. We don't want anyone to use this.
Heaven forbid this is utilized.
And so at that point, I mean, I had gone to architecture school. I'd been practicing for 5 years. And then I would go to grad school. And it was at this very parametric moment. Scott Cohen was the chair. We were talking about architectural autonomy through geometry. People were saying things like Rhino and Grasshopper and aggregation. And I was like, I don't know what any of this means. Like, I was like, this did not show up in my undergraduate education. Like, we sort of shamed people for drawing on the computer, you know?
Is a parametric moment like a digital turn?
Sure. Yeah. I don't know.
Who did the book, The Digital Turn?
Mario Carpo.
Mario
so that's
Carpo.
92.
And then you had the second. He's on the second digital turn.
Right.
And you had a parametric moment.
I had a moment with my parameters. I didn't know what any of it was. It was not a language that I had learned professionally or in my first degree. And it was something where we were using RhinoScript, Monkey Editor. I was spending like all day coding like one box, and I was like, why am I doing this? Like,
I had a similar experience. Like my school, University of Nebraska, it was there were people using the computer for different things, but there was no like actual digital process in play. And you learned how to draw, you learned how to make models using balsa wood, and you kind of really working the finger with the X-Acto knife, and making these models. And I remember I did a study abroad program in London, and I ended up hanging out at the AA around the exact same time, kind of like 2005, 2006, and seeing people like scripting architecture with like RhinoScript and Monkey Editor. When you said Monkey Editor, that brought me back. I was like, because they would like it's kind of the classic student thing to do, to like print out your code and put it up with your picture of your board. And
this counts. I can pin this up. This counts.
This thing works if you hit run on it, and it makes this pretty thing. And I remember my mind just being completely blown by the whole idea.
So I thought it was interesting, but it was also like what had attracted me to architecture was the craft, making things, like the act of creating things, and coding and programming felt really distant from that, at least in the way it was initially presented. And it kind of it felt like you ended up with a lot of like white swoopy things. And I found it really hard to evaluate, like, how do you decide that's a good white swoopy thing versus a bad swoopy thing, And so I kind of accidentally ended up, and it seems like everything happened by accident. I had a little more agency than that. I ended up started taking digital fabrication classes because it felt like a moment where all the coding added up to something which returned to some sort of notion of making and craft. And I could understand going through the kind of endless iteration of coding something if I got something at the end that was physical. So that was a way that I found into Grasshopper, Rhino. I mean, the point we were using digital project, generative components. There was sort of a lot of different workflows kind of floating around.
Using GC?
That was very briefly, because it was
a little GC.
It was a little complicated. Yeah. And so I think it was also like, Grasshopper had just been released, the version 1.0, like after explicit history. And we were all sort of just trying to figure out, like, how does this work? Because there were also, there's still the expectations that at the end of the day, you're making plans and sections. And I think it really was trying to figure out, like, the paperless studio had happened in Columbia, at Columbia University, and then kind of what was next. And I think that's still something we're struggling with because as a discipline, because, cutting a section from a Rhino model or a Revit model is really different than constructing one as an orthographic projection by hand, or even just like Dave's writing about first order drafting, which is how I learned, line at less than 0. And that was a really big shift of kind of what are the deliverables, or like what's the output of these models. And as a teacher, I think I struggle with that too, because it's very hard to desk credit someone if they're like, here, I'm going to like turn around my Rhino model. Like, is this good? And you're like, it's like we still use plans and sections and very specific ways of scaling drawings to evaluate them. And I think that's one of the struggles.
The industry hasn't caught up to that really yet either. I mean, the sort of the introduction of BIM sort of made, kind of created this promise that, the three-dimensional representation of the model and like the elements of a model are a kind of a digital like a complete digital representation of the model, and it's all its data, and like this attribute is an attribute of this wall, and this wall is an actual wall because you can cut a section through it. It's got all these layers, right? But yet it's like the primary output is still the two-dimensional drawing, and what we were in Chicago yesterday, right? And we were looking at a Mies building, and there's a lot of them, they're everywhere there.
There's a few.
And we were kind of like, how many sheets do you think went into the drawing set of this building?
Oh, right. Like probably like 30 on some of them.
Right. Yeah. That's like
not many at all.
I'm like, you could probably describe this building in like 2 sheets.
The Mies project in Des Moines recently got rehabilitated or restored, and they had a couple original drawings, and I think there was 3 sheets. And it was floor plan, and then the section, or plan detail,
right,
and then you're done.
And now what you have is like, okay, now you have these tools that let you like model the thing to like the nines, and then like, oh well, creating a section is an artifact, and so now you end up with these, and they're still putting out sheet sets for everything, but the sheet sets are giant because no one knows how to like filter this information, like, and the sort of the craft of actually putting together a coherent set of documentation is kind of being lost because we're just sort of in this awkward like one foot in both worlds in a way.
Right. I mean, I think if we're talking about our educations, like that idea of being in like one world and then another, and that those like that translation is still really fraught You know, you end up with building sections and plans with like every single like nut and bolt on a faucet modeled.
Yeah.
And you're like, did we need all that information?
Right.
You know, and I mean, I think especially when you're thinking about like means and methods and the AIA contracts and limits of liability, like software that you're looking at that maybe like, you know, Digital Project was used to like out of CATIA was coming from like an airplane. And do we need that level of detail if as architects we're not supposed to actually be in charge of means and methods? Mm-hmm. Like, do you want to be actually locating the screws in your faucets because you downloaded that model from the supplier? Or like, kind of what does that do to architectural representation and this authority that the drawing has?
So that to me then leads into this sort of next part of what you do, which is the digital fabrication side. Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden you're talking about a designer talking, you know, communicating directly with the means of production, right? And the rope, the arm that's going to make the thing, and you're sending instructions and code to this object, and it's like, okay, well, you know, if this were a typical paradigm, you're like, okay, I'm going to do the drawing. This is going to go through all of these layers of people, and you know, we're going to send it to a fabricator, and they're going to send you shop drawings back. But they're not actually going to build from the shop drawings. They're going to make their own like drawings, and then they're going to make the thing. But what the interesting thing about the digital fab conversation, right, is like, well, why can't the architect talk right to and right with these methods of fabrication? And I think that throws a lot of people for a loop. And I think I think it's a, you know, a place that's a lot of people want to go, but there's all this baggage that's still there. What's your perspective on that as someone that's doing that and researching it?
I mean, it's interesting. We're 25 years or more into, you know, this notion and this fascination with digital fabrication. And part of it is the kind of the excitement of saying like you have absolute control. You can fabricate right from your drawings. But I think when I'm teaching digital fabrication and I have a seminar that I run every semester that's about 25 students, it's really to sort of point out how much information isn't translated in a drawing. Mm-hmm. And things like which side of a line a laser cutter or CNC cuts on, and the huge differences of that. And I think that one of the things about sort of constantly dwelling in the digital world is that the connection to material and scale is really tough to maintain, because you're always at this, like, you can be very zoomed in. Mm-hmm. And we don't necessarily have models that are fully accounting for things like gravity. You know, you can model a crazy, and I see this all the time, like weird, like just structural system, and you're like, that doesn't actually hold anything up, you know, but it works in a model. And so I think what I think at least is a teaching skill with digital fabrication is going through that and seeing how much can go wrong on something that's very small. Mm-hmm. And saying, like, as an architect, like, I don't want to train everyone to go be a fabricator, but that as an architect, you're thinking about how every single line and everything you're doing has consequences that spin off into, you know, material, environment, labor, that there's a lot of ripple effects to something. The other thing, though, is that, like, as much as there seems to be this interest in skipping over the fabricators or this whole layer of people, there's so much knowledge there. And one of the things that I really like about working in Iowa is that I call people up and ask them questions, and they're interested and they want to work with us and they want to fabricate things. And if someone's been working in steel fabrication their whole life, they know a whole lot more about it than I do. Right. And I think there's also like a respect for the material knowledge of generations of people that I think we all have to be careful with, that I'm not going, you know, like any of us aren't going to know as much as like all of these different realms of material making. So I think that's kind of one of the things that's come through to me is like, how does this all pan out in labor practices and architecture?
Yeah, I think that's really where I think the hype of a lot of these tools does kind of create a bit of a, if we talk about projecting into the future, like a kind of a future that probably isn't right, because if you have sort of this knowledge of, you know, this trade knowledge of how to actually work with the material, that knowledge is very hard to replace. And I think people underestimate, especially in conversations about artificial intelligence and, the sort of machine learning paradigm, and this idea that automation is going to be like it is decimating industries for sure, but it's I think with the world that we're talking about here with fabrication and like kind of, building materials, I think it's a bit more complex than that, right?
I think so. And I think again, using fabrication to try to make even just like a 3D printed mold that has to cast something, and how many things with tolerances and undercuts and pressure and pieces and getting it to happen the same way twice. And just that there is a labor to fabrication. I think there's sort of this myth that you're just going to push a button and it all pops out.
It's amazing how many people actually claim they want that.
Right.
Even for design, people, even if it's, take the fabrication part out of it, we're often approached with some, a problem set where it's we want an algorithm that lays out and creates the whole building for us, and we just need to select between options. I'm like, do you really want to do that? It doesn't sound like too much fun to me.
Right.
And I think that's part of the reason why everyone got into architecture, is it's kind of fun.
It's kind of fun. I can both see all of the issues with the sort of increasingly esoteric digital fabrication culture in architecture, where it's sort of dwelling over here and practice is somewhere over here. Yeah. And also think it's really fun. And I think there has to be part of the reason for the lab that we have at Iowa State, and the name coming from computation and construction, is that what we're doing is trying to root those things more in building practices, and how to think about, in a place like Iowa, which has a very strong industrial culture, strong architecture culture, of how do you bring in this whole world of computation, which can be seen as sort of fussy and kind of elitist and outside of architecture, capital A, building, capital B. And how do you say 3D printing this is useful? Yeah. Or is it actually going to ever translate into architectural construction practices? Can you, when you're looking at 3D filaments and half of them can't go outside because they're not UV stable, you're kind of is this productive? Or I don't know. It opens up a lot of questions about automation, about assembly. I think there's a really Skylar Tibbetts writes a really good introduction to, I think it's an AD reader about 4D printing, where so much of this is the assembly time to do something that's ostensibly automated by people is, you see so many projects, and I've been guilty of this too, where you make little things and then it takes hundreds of hours to put it all in together. And I think that's where the questions of automation and labor and whether this is saving us anything or it's a good idea are, they open up a lot of things to debate, because especially if these things can only happen in spaces of, academic spaces where people are, you have students working or people who are maybe getting underpaid. What does that mean?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's, I don't think there's enough of a conversation around some of those more ethical, moral questions about where all of this tech is going, right? It's there's immense opportunity, but with every technology, there's two sides to what it can do and the impact it can have. The classic example being nuclear energy, right? Yeah. It's the ability to power an entire country, but also completely destroy one at the same time, right. And that's the extreme example of this. But automation, all of these new technologies, any kind of form of disruption, right? Uber, right, and kind of the challenging of unions, and is that something that we're behind? I mean, Uber's very convenient.
It is very convenient.
But the effect on wages, and we're seeing those protests.
I mean, it almost seems like some architecture firms that we talk with are simply waiting, they're waiting to be disrupted, right? They're taxi drivers were like, hey, wait a minute, and then it was too late. Is that going to happen in our industry, or are there enough people, companies that are becoming vertically stacked? Is that the next sort of movement in terms of disrupting our industry, and the people who are looking at that saying like, yeah, but I'm an architect, I shouldn't have to build the building too. That's not how it's been done.
Right. Yeah.
But certainly there's like a lot of lost time in making a basis of design, and then someone else figuring out what the actual build is, right?
Well, it's the means of production question, like, how and supply chains, right? Which is, I think, something that very rarely comes up, at least in, when we first have interactions with architects. I mean, there's sort of a notion that they, you take the supply chain as is, and then maybe we sort of marginally improve upon it with a couple of additional processes. But with the stuff that you're doing, and the research that's around digital fabrication and computation and all of these different things seems to suggest something far more fundamental and perhaps scary, that really does sort of introduce new organizational models behind, how people operate. You mentioned the program that you've started. So I think maybe the next question in terms of timeline is, how did you end up in Iowa?
How did I end up in Iowa?
Clearly, because Iowa State is a great school.
Yeah, go Cyclones.
Yeah, go Cyclones, yes.
I took the long way to Iowa. I finished graduate school.
Is there a short way to Iowa?
No, it's kind of it's true. It's kind of in the middle.
You can't fly there quickly. You have to go through a connection.
I say this as someone from Nebraska. We're kind of the
same. Don't throw stones. After graduate school, so I mean, I went to graduate school in 2008, right when the market crashed, and I think that was a really startling moment. I had come out of undergrad. I had spent time in New York when the real estate boom was huge. I worked at a firm that did ground up construction. We just were churning out projects. It was a really exciting time, and then all of a sudden, Lehman Brothers collapsed, and it was like game over. And I think realizing that how dependent on the market architecture was kind of a terrifying moment. And at the time, my boss, Rick Cook, had adopted his sons from Cambodia, and we had done pro bono work in Siem Reap at the Angkor Hospital for Children. So I'd worked on a project for 2 years without going. And then right as I went to graduate school, I went to Cambodia to photograph the project. And so I knew when I was graduating that I didn't want to have gone to grad school and then just go back to doing what I was doing before. It was, too much time and energy and money to kind of just go back. So I ended up applying for Fulbright to go to Cambodia. I spent 2 years working there on looking at flooding infrastructure and urbanization. And it was one of these things where all of the things about data that I learned in school, like GIS and mapping and all of this sort of big picture data management, sort of fell apart when you're in a place where you don't necessarily have data sets for everything. Those data sets couldn't always be ground truth. Like I would have maps, I would go look at the place that was on the map, and it just wouldn't be there, or like the flood would still be there, and it would be like, oh, we've replaced, this thing, and that shouldn't flood there. And the map would say the flooding's solved, and you'd be like, well, I'm looking at the flood. And so it made me think a lot about like who creates data, who manages it. Was it created independently? Was it created by someone trying to get a grant? Was it created by the government? Was it created by an NGO? And I think also just being in a place where it has a super complex history. The United States has a very complex history in Cambodia. We bombed Cambodia illegally for 16 months, give or take, and Laos during Vietnam. And to see a country trying to rebuild after losing almost an entire generation of its public education and professionals, they lost almost an entire generation of professors and engineers and architects and lawyers. And to kind of think about like what it means to have to pass knowledge from generation to generation was sort of the first time I really thought about being in education. And I ended up teaching at 2 universities there and working on a public festival and really trying to think about how architecture communicates to a public, and in a place where you have all these crises going on. You have, it's very hard to be like, oh, I'm going to talk about something really esoteric like water infrastructure and architectural culture in a place where you have people who are wanting for many other things. And so I think it really challenged me to try to think about why architecture is valuable. and how to talk about that to anybody who maybe isn't as into it as we are. Because when you're talking to an aid worker and they're like, I work in pediatric HIV care, and you're like, I teach architecture. There's like this interesting disconnect. And that took me to teaching with the University of Houston during the summers. It took students to Myanmar and Thailand and Vietnam, Cambodia. Came back to New York City and taught at Parsons during a festival called it was a Cambodian Arts Festival, Art and Architecture Festival, and was able to present some of the work. And so I think it was a moment where I was trying to say, like, how do you take these sort of high-tech, esoteric, I'm going to keep saying esoteric amount of words, I guess, way that we think and are taught, and make it applicable to anything aside from us all talking to each other. That took me to Louisiana State, where I was working on flooding infrastructure in the Coastal Sustainability Studio at Louisiana State and teaching architecture, and that resulted in a permanent exhibition for the Coastal Preservation and Restoration Authority, where that opportunity to think about digital fabrication and representation became an exhibit. And that was where, like, kind of thinking about how things become teaching instruments, tools of communication. There's a giant model that's like, I want to say 120 by 60 feet that Clint Wilson had built and his team of the lower Mississippi River Basin. And the reason was the physical modeling was actually more accurate and faster than simulation. And I thought that was a really powerful kind of counter argument to this idea that we need to simulate everything.
Right.
Like sometimes water flows downhill and like you don't need to, it's like when you run all these simulations in architecture school and you're like, and at the end I figured out the sun rises in the east. And you're like, oh, we could have saved those 3 months, so really thinking carefully about like the moments that we choose to use tools that are new, and are we just using them because they're new? And do they teach us anything that we didn't already know? So, I mean, I think that was a moment where we're really thinking about how do you kind of instrumentalize architectural education, and that there's something that gets out of the academy, that it's important that it's not just sort of an echo chamber. And that became the job at Iowa State, where I was asked to rethink how we were doing design build and digital fabrication, which, at least in my education, had been some very different cultures. Like design build was, Carhartts and hammers and 2x4s, and like it was very bro-y. And then computation was,
you're swinging a hammer.
Yeah, as men do. And you're like typing like Mel script, like da, 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 over here. And there's like, these are two groups of people in architecture that like don't talk to each other. So you're like, okay, how do we take these two things, computation and construction, and put them together? And using digital fabrication as that platform has been the way that's happened. So that's led to building a lab over the last 3 years. We just got to KR10 robotic arms, which is really exciting. I'm excited. And, I think more than anything, it's been kind of a hearts and minds campaign. Like, I think as much as we talk about technology, it's like you have to tell, like, why does anyone care? Like, why does it matter?
Where was Iowa State at the time you joined, in terms of like its overall facilities and
Are my colleagues watching?
Well, and even I can speak to that as being a student there at the time, and I was just getting out of school. I actually didn't know about Grasshopper. Because it was just released right as I was leaving school, and there were some, innovative things in terms of, we're getting space for a second laser cutter, and that was useful. But there was still a, pen to the paper, really deliberate aesthetic decisions that were not old school, but very sort of ingrained in purpose. That was taught throughout my studios, I thought, but there wasn't a lab for playing with a plasma cutter, right? Or understanding the implications of wanting to cast a specific type of concrete footing that was from a 3D printed cast, right? Right. And so it's exciting for me to see those things, come up from the ground up.
Well, I bring it up because it's, for any form of digital transformation to actually occur, it's pretty important to have an idea of what the current state is, right? And you're kind of, and that's something that we always, I feel like we have to challenge our clients on is when we kind of come in and help with a strategy, it can be a pretty kind of painful process to sort of sit and be like, where are we at right now?
Right.
And how far off are we from the mark of where we want to be? Right. And so when it, I think of like where an academic institution is starting versus where you've taken it, I think it's pretty remarkable to see.
It's been exciting. I mean, I think one, it was something that was being asked to be done. So there was support. It's also that there was already a lot of really strong design culture existing. There was a really strong sci-tech culture, so structures, building science, environmental science. And so that when I started, I really was trying to think of digital fabrication and computation both as that building science side, and then also that it had a theoretical underpinning, that there is a history, that there's theories, that there's ethics, that it isn't this thing that stands outside or separate, and that it isn't just this random seminar you take for 3 credits where you like click on stuff and then you're like, I know technology. That there was like a space and a culture that was created through the lab. Because when I started, we basically had 3 laser cutters and then 1 CNC that was being shared for the college, and there's 7 departments in the college. And so I thought it was important that we did something that was specific to architecture and architectural education. And again, that it was rooted in design, that it was design first, and that the computation and construction aspects came out of design culture.
Right, which is being able to answer the question why. Like, why do we need all these things? And they're not trying to use machine learning. Like, hey, let's use machine learning without really knowing what the purpose is or why that needs to be on this project. You need to learn about the merits of having a robotic arm and what those things can do for you. So the next time the opportunity comes up, you can apply the knowledge on how to do that. But you're not going to start with the robotic arm.
Right. And I think it's also like this transition from first order modeling into computational modeling is a really tough step. And I mean, part of it was going from primarily using SketchUp and Revit to Rhino, and getting people excited, because I think it was like, why do you want me to change softwares? Like, Revit's free. I don't need to I can use it with my EDU license. And then, like really small things, like we got Rhino in the bookstore, we got a discount, it's $95 for them to put it on their computers, and like showing things that all of a sudden, like the connection to things that students were seeing like online at other schools, and understanding like, oh, like that's how this is accessible. Like this is something I can do, because I think one of the myths of technology is that it's unknowable. And that there are people who get it and then people who don't. And in all of my classes, what I'm trying to do is say, like, this is not something people are born knowing how to do. There are certainly people who are extremely gifted coders and can see patterns in places the rest of us can only dream of. But the rest of it is teachable. Like, these are skill sets, they're things you can learn, and they're at least things you can learn to talk about. You maybe don't want to be that person that's doing it, but at least that you can have a conversation with somebody. So I think it's that demystification that's been really important, that like this whole black box mentality is really exclusionary in a lot of ways.
This is where I see a ton of overlap with what we see in like professional practices, where there's a struggle to bring certain people on board with a new approach. And there's a big drive in practices where you have like, oh yeah, we need to be bolstering our skill sets in computation, and the tendency is to really push the young folks that are coming in that may have taken one of your courses and learned Grasshopper, to get them in a spot where they can use some of those tools. Right. But everyone kind of forgets about the project manager and like these people that are in leadership positions that are in maybe a mental spot where they're like, oh, this is unknowable to me. But they're the ones that are kind of responsible for making sure it's successful. And so it really is a cultural change. And for you kind of led it in kind of your academic program, it seems.
Yeah, because I think the hard part for all of this is that as fast as technology is changing, I mean, I remember people not knowing AutoCAD, or we were rendering in 3ds Max, and they'd come and they'd say, can you just change that? And you're like, oh, if you just hadn't said just, that it's, that the complexity of like how things are constructed and like what that means for editing is something that I do think if you can push that up the chain, or if you're able to explain things and communicate what you're doing to people who are stakeholders, be it in an academic context or a professional one, then it's like, oh, I get it, or at least I can understand why it matters that you created a model this way, even though like no one really wants to see your data trees. Like,
so I know you've...
No one wants to see the data trees?
Oh my God.
No one wants
we
to
talked about this. No. But the data trees are so important. No.
Don't tell Dave.
I know. I said it at lunch and I thought he was like, you know, he's a little devastated.
Yeah, we almost threw her out of lunch.
Yeah.
So you've looked at computation in sort of a historical context where even looming is a type of algorithm, right? What did you uncover through thinking about computation that way and having a hands-on sort of process with a material that had a parallel with how software works right now?
I'll think a few things. I mean, one is that a lot of this isn't that new. You know what I mean? Like CNC technology comes out of World War II. And I think that when we treat things like they're new and that therefore you have somehow failed to catch on to the newness, it also makes them inaccessible. So teaching the history, opening up the G code and being like, look, like we're looking at X, Y, and Z. Like you may not totally understand everything, but you know how to like graph a point in space. And like that's not in and of itself that complex.
Right.
And that's the sort of thing that I think kind of opens up understanding that, you know, computer science has a history and architecture intersected with computer science at a certain moment. But when you go back and you read like Bush and Engelhardt and I'm trying to think of some of the other early pioneers that I'm totally blanking on. But when they're writing about the future of computer science and they're looking at things like trying to solve the problem of zooming and clicking and hyperlinks and like, but there is such a excited ethical project too. Like these are people who came out of World War II where science and technology had been co-opted into war, and following the war, they're thinking like, there's a lot of other things you can do with these technologies. And there was an excitement that these things were social projects and that they had ethical implications. Then it mattered whether you use nuclear energy to blow someone up or make energy.
Yeah.
And that sort of teaching that history and showing things like logic statements, like if-then statements, and saying like, this is 16th century writing, like computation precedes the computer, like thinking about computation precedes the computer, so that there's a way to talk to people about it as a way of thinking and a way of framing problems rather than merely a technical issue. Because I think it gets sort of dismissed as being like, oh, it's just tech, or it's only tech, it's not design. Where, you know, someone comes and they like show you like a crumpled ball of paper and they're like, I want to model that. And you're like, there is no like crumpled paper like grasshopper plugin. Like,
yeah.
I mean,
but maybe there should be.
Maybe.
And hire Nate. He'll help you with that.
You got that one in development. There is the cat in the box is my favorite
LunchBox
one.
3.0 coming soon with crumpled paper tool.
Oh no. But like, how do you look at that, whatever it is, and ask a computational question, I think is what I'm trying to do. The other thing is to try to visualize what is an algorithm. Like we've been using card weaving, which is they're basically, it's a 2,000-year-old technology. You basically have cards of many shapes of holes in them, and you run a different color thread through each, or the same color, but they can go forward, they can go backwards, and they can flip left to right. And that means that you've already taken the number of strings times the number of cards times front times back, and you get like X number of solutions. And I think that makes sort of, like, again, it's like the demystifying, like, what happens when you make an algorithm? How does that work? And, like, trying to somehow make those processes physical as a way to understand them as digital processes.
Interesting.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great way to sort of take those things out of a mysterious context and bring them sort of a place where you can touch it, literally.
Right. But it's also, like, you're putting people in a place where it's, like, you're supposed to all, like, you know, especially in a professional program, like know all of architecture and like sort of know computer science and know this and know that. And like kind of the expectation of expertise in any of those areas becomes really complicated. because like that's like 5 degrees, you know, that you're supposed to know before you're like 22.
Is part of your curriculum to bring in like other experts from some of those disciplines that you just mentioned to kind of come in and kind of support?
Yeah, I mean, we've had you guys come in, Proving Ground.
Steve and Dave.
Yeah.
I didn't get the invite.
I'm sorry. I'm sure you were very busy.
He's been working on
the
new
crumpled
LunchBox,
the crumpled paper plugin.
It's been in development a long
time. We've also brought in weavers, people who work in textiles. I co-taught a class with a textile artist and assistant professor of art and visual culture, Olivia Valentine. I think that's what's exciting, is like having a physical space and a conceptual space to bring people into, to be like, tell me what you do with computation or what you do that's near this, and that it's actually generating that conversation that's more exciting than anything else, I think.
What would you say, like, when it came to the overall or introduction of the program, the development of the program, what was the biggest challenge? There's a thing that kept you up at night. Like, how am I gonna get through this part of it? I
mean, part of it is just like the literal tooling up, which I think goes back to this feeling that architecture is kind of waiting for someone to solve the technology problem and then they'll get on board or something. And that it's like physically getting machinery going, getting software installed. And also I think, those are sort of like the logistical issues. I really do think making it into something where like this Hearts and Mind campaign is like that people were excited and that it wasn't just this random thing where you sort of, like I said, are like put off to the side. It's just like yet another weird thing, that it becomes like there's a centrality to computation that's not, and that I think was probably the toughest. But I think that, again, by focusing on constructed work and on fabricated work and having something to show and have it be exciting and have it be designed work and not, not data trees. I know.
I'm gonna have to make a lot of edits.
That was the part where, to go to a really strong design program and try to say like, this isn't going to ruin architecture is what keeps me up at night.
Well, and it sounded like there was, some change management. It's like, how do you order a new circuit, a 20 amp circuit for, what is this again? Well, and like we are on the old soundstage for Iowa Public Radio and Television because they moved upstairs.
Oh, why didn't we do this here? Why didn't we do this there? We should have came to you.
So it's actually a really good fit because it's columnless space. It's a slab on grade. It had a really high electric load. So like all these things that you don't think about until you do, putting a several ton piece of equipment on a slab on grade was something we could do easily. We have the electric load to add all of these things in the space. So there's that. And I think it's, just hoping it all came together, which, it's still a work in progress. And I think especially coming into something where like, this isn't new, like we are not the first school to ever have a robotic arm. So how do you create a space for yourself and your program that we're never going to have as much money as MIT or Harvard or some of the big programs where, the funding is just going to be much more significant. We're a state school. We run a very lean tuition, which I think is also something that's important given sort of the student loan burdens of people graduating. And that how do you kind of create that caliber of work that can compete or at least be seen outside of the place is probably the biggest challenge.
You've also written and talked about women in architecture.
Yeah.
And there's statistics that the number of women versus men who are entering architecture school, and by the time everyone graduates, the percentage of women drops, and then the folks that become licensed, the number of women drops, and then the folks that become C-level positions in architecture firms, guess what? The number drops.
But the stat is, I think, is it 10% of like the top like top tier, like C-level director, principal positions. I think I think it's the U.S. are women. It's like, and then it's like 6 or 8% if you go into the technology space,
right?
Like on IT roles,
right?
And so, what did you find in looking into that? And there's clearly barriers somehow and somewhere, right?
Sure.
Have you gleaned any insights on that in general? I mean, that's a pretty broad question, but I mean, like from
Steve, it depends on how much.
Part 2, right after this.
How much time do you have? I think at least I've thought a lot about this. It's something that I came to kind of late. I think a lot of when I talk to my colleagues, and especially my female colleagues, that many of us sort of avoided these questions because we felt like, as elder millennials or whatever we are, these were battles that have been fought and won, that we were of the generation where equality would be achieved and that this had all been sorted out. Like our mothers and our grandmothers and had just sort of gotten this done for us. And I think it wasn't, a couple of things happened at the same time. I mean, the 2016 campaign was particularly devastating. I think the language of that campaign was really problematic, regardless of how you feel about Hillary Clinton as a politician. The way she was spoken about in the media was very gendered. And around the same time, a little bit earlier, the Pritzker petition to have Denise Scott Brown recognized for her work with Robert Venturi was denied. And I think those were things where, as I started to move from intern to someone who's in charge, really struck me. In that, you start to look around and you're over and over the only women in the room sometimes. And it's always tricky when you talk about gender, especially since even just a singular gender is exclusionary. You can't speak on behalf of everybody. But I think the data is there, if we're talking about data, that we're not making progress towards equity as quickly as a profession which thinks of itself as progressive should be.
Right.
We've increased the number of licensed women over 20 years by 8% from 10 to 18. And if you run that out as a projection and you say there's no other interventions, we just just sort of we'll wait it out, you're looking at almost 2,100 before you reach 50%. And I think that tells you that I'm only willing to have a conversation if you can accept that women are not less capable architects or less capable technicians, which unfortunately, we all read the Google memo, is not actually a belief that everyone holds.
Right.
But say that's true, that women are equals. There has to be cultural reasons that we're stuck in these data points not moving.
Right.
And I think those are the questions that any of us can only work in our wheelhouse. And as an educator, I started looking at my syllabus. I started looking at what I was teaching, how I was teaching it. And I think it's really hard not to reperform your own education. And if your education or our education was steeped in canons of men are architects and only men and predominantly white men, and technologists are predominantly white men, how do you not teach the same thing over again? And so I think looking back at histories of computer science and realizing things that, no one had ever told me, like women were early computers. Yeah. They physically moved punch cards. They were there at the beginning of computer science. That there were very specific moments.
They wrote code that sent rockets to the moon.
Right. I think we all saw Hidden Figures. I think of how many other people contributed to narratives of technology that aren't necessarily talked about because the mythologies of Silicon Valley and hoodies and disrupting and that you don't see those examples quite as often as we should. And I don't think it's necessarily this idea of victimhood. I think it's a shame, and I think architecture and the world and technology are losing out by excluding so many voices. Through classism, through misogyny, through racism. I think less than 1% of licensed architects are African-American women. Yeah. And I wonder if, you're talking about alternative timelines, I would love to see what a world would look like where you had a full representation of people contributing to the built environment. Would it be different than what we have now?
I think it would this came up in my conversation with Rachel, and there are so many problems right now in the construction industry.
Right.
And it seems that because the views and the people of influence in the construction industry and architecture are so swayed in one direction that we're not getting ideas from a much broader range of folks.
Right.
That how are we going to solve some of these problems? Because you absolutely need different perspectives
right.
and different backgrounds. And
well, if you even think about bathrooms, I mean, this question of bathrooms and architects and having building code that says that you have to have two different genders in a building. And, if you don't have someone at the table who's going to say to you, like, I have to go to a different building to use the bathroom because you don't have a single stall restroom here with a locking door. Like, that's a conversation that's important to hear. And if you don't have someone who is trans at the table to have that or bring that up, it's something that could very easily not be acknowledged.
Well, I mean, there's having a number of friends that are architects, including my wife. The stories that they always kind of bring up about, like you brought up bathrooms, like mother's room.
Yeah.
In a building, like I didn't know what one was, and a lot of the people that are in like these planning sessions are like yeah, we brought up, well, where's the mother's room go? And like, what's that? And
right.
and these are like really like important like things to like be bringing into the built environment, and just by the fact that it's not some of those problems are not a known thing. You're automatically biasing the architecture itself.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry, Nate. What if a family has two fathers? What would that room be called? Okay.
Well, I was bringing up like
drops the mic. No, I'm just kidding.
It's not what I was getting at, Steve. I'm just kidding.
But I think, it goes to this, like, if you have one type of person who is, and again, you can't really broadly generalize any group of people, but if it feels like power and authority and decision making are dwelling with a very specific group of people, that you're going to get a very different result than if you have other, inputs, if you will. And I think that if, we're thinking about, if you want to think about a future that's more exciting or more equitable than the present, then I think that room for voices and for conversation is really the best place to start on a lot of these things.
So you're, was it 2017, and was that the MIT Acadia?
Yeah.
You had a paper that was kind of a branch of this and very focused on computation. Was it computational feminism?
Computational feminism. So Nick Sinsky and Leslie Forehand and I started at Iowa State at the same time, and this was an effort to try to bring this discourse into a place which I don't know that it would be. I wasn't sure if it would be welcomed. We had gone to the Kuminkat database and had searched feminism and came back with one hit. And there's nearly 13,000 paper abstracts. And so I think what it said is that, again, to go back to these questions of ethics in computation, Maya Brzezinski from, I think she's the University of Waterloo, wrote a really great paper in 2018 looking at broader metrics of ethics in the Kuminkat database and computation. But it was to take to a group of people who are super smart and do a lot of really interesting creative things and say, feminism as a place of research has a very long history of thinking about technology. And technology, at least architectural technology, doesn't seem to share that viewpoint. It's not looking at histories of feminism or maybe racism or other forms of exclusion as ways to operate, or at least it doesn't seem like that. And so we wrote this paper and took it to Acadia and presented it. And I think it was interesting just the conversations that came out of that and how people sort of come up to you afterwards. And
what was the most interesting reaction you got to that paper, like in terms of people talking to you about it, or even in the aftermath, people that may have read it and reached out to you?
A lot of women came up and said, thank you. And that was surprising because I sort of felt like people were going to be like, you can't speak on my behalf, which maybe people felt that way and just didn't tell me. I think later in the conference, Neil Leach was like, I got a book, it's full of women. And
binders full of them.
Like I was like binders full of them. And I think that gets to one of the biggest issues when we end up talking about issues of gender is that you end up with two narratives of one of exceptionalism and one of tokenism, where everyone says, oh, like I know a woman who's fantastic. She architects all the time. And then they're like, you know, here's like the name. And they're like, clearly there's no issues. And that narrative of exceptionalism, like saying Barack Obama was able to become president, racism is over in America, is really damaging because it says like these are individual problems. It says it is a person as an individual's job to overcome some sort of structural inequality, not that the system needs to change. And I think, you know, you go to AIA meetings, you go to tech meetings, and you're looking around and going, this is awfully white. And it's usually predominantly male. I mean, I don't know that I've ever been to a predominantly female tech conference, but I'll be sure to let you know when I do. Especially in architecture, I'm sure they exist. One. Yeah, we should be like, this is like Lady Tech Club. We were thinking we should start like Wacadia, which is like women in Acadia. But I think those are the things that become really problematic. And like I said, like if we're using data to do things like that isn't neutral. Like even continuing the status quo is political. And then I think one of the things I feel nervous about is when I hear data being used as this place where it's like this space that's somehow, you know, like it's outside of these conversations, that it's somehow excluded from this. It's apolitical. It's above.
Neutral, somehow neutral. Like, it's like if you're able to bring it back to the data shows us X.
Right.
And you know, how can you argue with that? And it's like it's a big problem with just the notion of data driven, right? It's like, you know, if you're driven, it's interesting to kind of have these, okay, we're going to have an empirical method that uses data as like sort of this baseline, but data itself, as you've talked about already in your experience in Cambodia and like kind of in going to places where you're reading maps about places that don't exist actually, I mean, there's serious problems with data, you know.
How do you guys avoid it in your work that you don't end up caught in some sort of positivist trap, like where you're like, I have solved the problem that I created and I made the data that solved the problem, which that's why I'm a little fearful for machine learning in the sense that if you feed the machine bad data,
right.
Yeah,
and then you're like, look, I solved it, like you're going to end up with bad stuff.
No, you know, like, that's I mean, you know, part of our engagement with this problem is, I would say, you know, if we create an algorithm or you know, some grasshopper routine, or we start to employ machine learning in any way, I would say that one of the hardest things to do that consumes most of our time is being able to before we hand it off, describe where the problems are in the data, and like you can rely on it for this, but you cannot rely on it for that. And you know, it's giving you this answer, but there is a probability that it's a certain percentage correct. And that's what, you know, I think one of the misconceptions that I've come across is that, oh, well, you know, if you know, the machine learning algorithms can get better and better the more data you feed it. But if you're feeding it more bad data, then it's just going to get dumber and dumber, really. It's just going to be making more bad decisions and not fewer. But then there's also like, you know, a lot of these algorithms have like, you know, that they'll predict something, but they also give you, you know, a probability of correctness, like, and a lot of people, I think, sometimes ignore that, you know, and say like, oh, it gave me this answer, I'm just going to take it. So, I mean, it all comes back to education, right? It's like, how do you educate a client or a student that's really excited about these things, but then to give them the critical methods by which they can start to, you know, unpack what you're producing and designing with it.
And I mean, for you guys, when you're working, like, the challenges of getting away from the language of optimization, efficiency, that there's this sort of this idea that there's going to be this totally optimal, you know, numbers-based solution, but what is that sort of accounting for? Because I think like what I feel like is like you can get this, like, you're like, oh, I like optimize this facade, but the material that you need to make that facade is going to have to be purchased in this place that possibly has like unfavorable labor conditions and factories, and then it's going to be shipped between continents to be installed, and then, you know, that the sort of consequences of whatever that optimization is feel like they aren't necessarily always being played out. And then also, why is optimization in and of itself the end game?
Yeah. Any, like, if you take like we had a prolonged podcast on the generative design conversation, and
I watched it.
You did?
I did.
Excuse me.
Nate's a little verklempt.
People watch it.
I read Dave's article. I had signed Dave's article.
Well, the assumptions on what you kind of encode into any of these like systems are just as important in terms of what you leave out, right? And these are not autonomous systems. It's like part of the myth of these kind of more algorithmic driven processes, or like an AI driven process, is that, I'm just going to ask the computer a question as if I'm having a conversation with a person, and it's going to give me a result that is somehow more correct than a person would give me because it has all of this data behind it. But if the constraints and the data set is wrong, then the thing's going to be wrong. And optimization itself, I think there is a trend that people are getting into a grayer area with that. You have optimization, which is sort of a drive towards one solution, but then there's, I think where it becomes interesting is when you have multi-objective, searches, and you have to somehow balance out a couple of things. I still think we're in a place with that conversation where it's still overly simplistic. Like you just talked about, again, like a supply chain. And a supply chain is very rarely, in my experience and what we've seen, a constraint. It's like, they're a little bit more simplistic in how, I have this amount of material that costs something, and then I have this material which costs something, and then there's a weight that impacts the structure, and everything's kind of very localized and kind of a self-contained thing that never extends out to these bigger issues. I don't have an answer for you, I guess, is what I'm getting at, but it's like, that's a big problem when it comes to like when we talk about digital transformation and where the fundamental effects of it are. It's in these bigger supply chains, and who's doing the work and how is it being delivered. And I just don't think we're there, and I don't think many people are at all.
Well, it's how do you start capturing data about the further streams of the entire process, right? How do you start to understand? The supply chain is actually something that you could integrate.
Well, we were talking about this at lunch, and like the notion of sort of the digital panopticon. Like if you are tracking every single thing that happens in a project, does that open up better data for ethical conversations, or do you end up in a very sort of draconian state?
That's a big problem. I mean, the answer to that question is, again, we don't know, because the construction industry is really bad at data in general. Like, I think part of the problem, reason why maybe a lot of these algorithms and these systems that we think about for optimization aren't talking about precisely what you just brought up, is because the data there is highly inaccessible or non-existent, and maybe that's an area of that really requires research from the academy and the profession to really bring some of that data to a point where we can act on it in a meaningful way. What do you see? I mean, being in academia, I think there's a perception, and certainly I have this perception, that there's a disconnect between the academy and practice. I think this perception, this has historic roots. I mean, there's always been the tension between the academy and practice. Where are we at this moment in time when it comes to like this kind of conversation? Like, what's your view of
State of the Union, State of the Union address?
I don't know. No, I mean, it's a question that I think about all the time. Like, how do you train someone for a profession that is changing every day? What does it mean? Because you end up in this sort of conversation about like, all right, we're training people to be autodidacts, but at the same time, that means that there's no expertise that's like left to train. And I think that part of the issue goes back to that there's a long history of of the orthographic projection as the means by which we teach architecture. And then that there's a whole history of, hand drafting and learning to craft perspective and things like that, that then is it valuable to teach that and then say okay, you're going to go work for a firm, you're going to use Revit, you're never going to draft again. You're trying to create a way of thinking and approaching problems that translates both across softwares or ways of thinking, but from an academic context into a professional context. That nothing we're going to be able to do in the academy I don't think that the academy should be a simulation for practice. And so what are the skills that can happen in that as a place where you can experiment, fail, and learn without necessarily all of the issues that you're going to need to address as a practitioner. I'm hoping that what we can give out of an architectural education right now is curiosity and the ability to go out and talk to a bunch of people who aren't like you and to ask questions, because we don't build architecture for ourselves. We build architecture for people beyond ourselves. And I think that if there's something that needs to change in architectural education and in the practice, is that authorship is not singular. Awards like the Pritzker go to a person, and that it's only been awarded to a collaboration, I think twice, maybe 3 times, and once to a woman in practice. And that notion of how things are made, authorship of that, and the way that is, accredited, or the way we talk about the built environment is something that across both realms needs to change. Because I think this sort of Bauhaus and Beaux-Arts studio models of the master teaching the students, and that you go and you glean excellence from being near someone, is something that needs to change. But I also think the profession has to change how it awards work.
Yeah. Well, everything you sort of described, it's sort of the trades model, right? Yeah. Where it's you go and you work under someone, and you're going to go through these steps and learn from a master and do that. It's interesting how prevalent that still is, even in practice. And it's a great area of tension I see, because when we come back to the space of technology, the people that are the masters of their domain in either a studio or in a professional context, less and less have mastery over the means with which architecture is produced. And so you have this, these young folks again coming in. With
young people.
Those young people with I know how to use an algorithm and kind of I have a base understanding of this thing, and then
you end up with a voronoi.
Yeah, well, right. And that's a wrap, folks. But
hey, I got a joke for you.
Oh, what's that?
What do you call a voronoi in Iowa?
What?
A cornoi.
Oh. Wow.
Done. My students came up with that. I thought it was pretty good.
That's pretty good.
You could use it in Nebraska too.
We could.
Yeah.
We have corn here.
You have corn.
We have a lot of it. So much.
I'm sorry. You were trying to say something.
I lost it.
It was intelligent.
I think there's going to be a whole section here where we're going to be like, yeah, edit.
Oh, okay.
Okay. I think my point was more, that disconnect between people that are in charge or in these positions of power and people that are, beginning to wield these new capabilities and insights, really, and are being inquisitive about certain things that the folks in charge don't even know where to begin with.
Yeah.
And there's there's all sorts of conversations that happen around what does it mean to cross mentor. That's even the term mentor is very much like it's a generational concept. People think it's all about mentoring, but it doesn't quite work that way anymore, it seems, when it comes to some of these newer concepts that the profession's changing so fast. And
I think we also, you guys talked about student loans in a previous podcast. When you have a generation of architects who are, maybe wouldn't have been architects a generation ago and are laboring under huge student loans, it's going to change the risks that people are willing to take. I think in the way that the discipline can develop. Like if it's a discipline that like historically relied upon being wealthy to even be part of it, and that you could start a firm that didn't need to make any money because that wasn't your source of income, then, you know, you set up a model that's basically impossible to keep replicating. And so I think that's going to be something where, you know, the discipline is really wrangling with that.
I mean, it's I think architecture school is still got to be in the top 10 or close to the top 5 of the most expensive disciplines to go into. Like you're automatically starting out in a situation where the people that go to architecture school are in a very privileged position, you know.
Hear that, kids? Don't join architecture school unless you're already privileged.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think
that's staying in.
Yeah. Oh boy. I mean, okay. All right. Let's. No.
Okay. No, but I mean, I did a very poor job answering the academy profession divide. But I'd be curious, from your perspective, do you feel like there are things that when students are graduating and coming to you, you wish they knew, or is this always a case of the next generations looking down at the generation after them and being like, they've been ruined? You know, like. I don't. Is that sort of the history of everything, you know?
I mean, the things that we look for when we bring on someone, like the interns, for example, that we'll be having in, had less to do with digital capability, I think, and more about looking at the things that you mentioned earlier, sort of the inquisitiveness, the ability to be critical, creative thinkers and problem solvers, and, you know,
someone who can communicate, who can simply communicate their ideas, right?
Right.
Learning Grasshopper and coding, as you said, is like these are teachable things. I mean, and you know, there are people that are perhaps more gifted and more inclined to do it than others. But you know, I've worked with some people that were very like, you could see like the wheels grinding in their head when you're showing them how like a couple of nodes connect together. But eventually they have a moment where like, okay, I get this, I can get through this. And some of the more challenging audiences we've done workshops with are like executives of firms that maybe on a day-to-day basis don't touch anything except Outlook.
Right.
And the challenge becomes, okay, well, and part of our kind of motive for doing those types of workshops is saying like, you need to know at least enough to where you can manage your staff a little bit better by knowing what these capabilities are. And if you can do this, if you can connect a couple of nodes together and get a voronoi.
Why do you keep saying that word?
You said it first.
I know. Sorry. Take it back.
Then maybe you're able to ask your staff a few more questions about what you could be doing to help manage the projects better, and what a firm can be doing to like be accounting for these new capabilities to enable their staff to learn and grow in different ways.
And I mean, I think as you guys are talking to people about digital strategy, I think one of the biggest challenges I'm facing as a teacher is that there's new things coming out every single day. And you're like, at what moment do you choose to say like, I'm going to teach you this version of this software on this day, or this workflow that in 5 years might be completely irrelevant, and that sort of constant running in place of trying to catch up to technology. Like, you know, we got a 3D printer that now is 3 generations old and it's only 2 years old, you know, and you're like, okay, like there's really no way to stay on that cutting edge unless you have tons of capital and kind of endless energy for like recreating the machine as a place. And so I think that's another question for architecture of kind of how do you keep retooling if things are changing so quickly. Like at what point do you say, okay, every 5 years I retool, every year, every 6 months, every 3 months? Like what's the sort of cycle where it's valuable to sit down and be like, okay, we're going to change our strategy again? I have one more question for you guys.
All right.
Can you tell me, what is the post-digital? I keep reading, and I just don't understand.
The post-digital?
Yeah.
We have a few more hours, I think, on my hard drive.
All right.
Well, it's a term that keeps popping up in academic culture, and it isn't something. Not that I mean anything academic gives you a straight answer, but I feel like it's a particularly convoluted.
I'm gonna call it and say I don't think architects have any room to talk about being post-digital if they haven't first had their head around what digital means. Like there's this tendency, and you see it in like architecture history, to kind of rebel against the previous era.
Is this like the postmodernism of digital?
Yeah, it's just it's
everything got real pastel. I feel like I see a lot of pastels, and that
collagey.
Feels very postmodernism to me.
It's very my view of it is very it's very superficial as an idea. Like it's kind of coming. Kind of trying to bring back these tropes of representation from a previous era, as if it somehow gets back to
authenticity or trying to be too perfect. It's imperfect.
Yeah, there's sort of that level of imperfection to it.
Is there nostalgia to it?
I think that's a big driver too. Yeah. I mean, there's sort of this nostalgic factor. I also feel like it's a result of there being a little bit of an insecurity and intimidation about a lot of these advancements that are being made in the digital space. That there's sort of a yearning for maybe a simpler time about like an architect and their idea and their image.
Back when we used Release 14.
Yeah, but the most hilarious part about it to me is the fact that we're going to start using Photoshop a little bit more, and we're going to make these representations. But those things are so laden with algorithms and digital capabilities and things like that it's like
are you really escaping?
Yeah, you're not escaping anything. You're not post anything. And I think maybe, some would argue that the idea of post digital, like the post part of it, is somewhat of a, it's misnamed in some way, but it's kind of a weird thing. I don't
It all seems very clever, but I don't understand what I don't feel like I'm in on the joke.
It's because you're the butt of the joke.
Oh, just me.
All of us. But what's interesting.
I want to laugh with them instead of being laughed at.
I have now like maybe 2 or 3 instances of just like kind of trashing post digital on my Facebook. Okay. And they're the ones that like get the most reaction out of people.
That's why I asked. Actually, what I've learned about the post digital has been in your Facebook comments.
You're perpetuating the issue, Nate.
I'm perpetuating the issue through shit posting about post digital. Like that to me like encapsulates post digital. It's like it's a shit post movement.
Nate posts the most shit posts on Facebook per capita
about post digital. It's very qualifying.
Yes.
And scene.
Okay.